And with us to talk about it is France 24's Marc Perelman. We're also joined from Dakar by journalist Dame Babou. Thank you for being with us here on France 24. End of an era or not, I ask for you first, Dame Babou, because we've seen with both Gabon and Ivory Coast, the French no longer have control of their military bases, those military bases, but they still have a military presence. What's going to happen next where you are?
Say that will be a beginning of the end of an era, because if you put it in the context of Africa, today all the governments in this area that was for former French colonies, they have a problem with their youth. The main problem is the youth. The perception is not necessarily the fact of there is a problem between the two countries as such, but this government in Mali, in Senegal, in Ivory Coast, in Gabon, they have no choice but to show their youth that we are getting our sovereignty, as they call it. But it's not necessarily the end, because this is not the end of the military cooperation between Senegal and France. If you remember, there is the school that forms officers of these armies from many African countries. The school is still working with French instructors, with French teachers and professors. That's not the end of an era, but the image of having France with the military base that has never changed in the form and in the substance since it was created. It was like a portion of France inside Senegal without any relations with the population.
All right, and Marc Perelman, this is quite different from what we saw recently in Chad, where it was basically overnight that the country's strongman said, France out, and a cutting of bilateral defense agreements, which we haven't seen in this case.
Right, and it all started actually in the Sahel, after the coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The French troops had a very strong presence fighting jihadist groups. They were kicked out by the new regimes. Obviously, this was not something that was concerted. And then France wanted to keep a presence in the countries where it was not kicked out from. There was actually a special envoy that was appointed by Emmanuel Macron, Jean-Marie Bockel, former minister, who spent a lot of time trying to negotiate in Chad, in Senegal, in Gabon, in Ivory Coast, to kind of find a new format whereby France would still have a presence, a much lighter footprint, but still be there. And he was optimistic that there would be an agreement. However, it didn't happen that way. In Chad, as you said, there were tensions between the regime and France, and overnight, essentially, the French were told, get out of there. And in Chad, it was a major, major military presence for decades of France. They intervened from there in Libya and so on and so forth. It went more smoothly with Ivory Coast and Gabon, where the relationship is better, but nevertheless, there's no formally a French presence, a permanent presence there. And in Senegal, when the new leadership arrived last year, there was a decision formalized by the president, as we saw in the report in November, that this is the end of it. And the French didn't have a choice. Basically, yes, there was a nice ceremony today, we'll cooperate in different ways and so on, but the French were not asked whether they could remain. They were essentially shown the door, politely but firmly.
You heard, though, Dame Babou saying there's still going to be French soldiers in Senegal as instructors and the like. Let me ask you, Marc Perelman, the French at this particular point in time, is it a burden for them or to have are they spread too thin? We're at a time of budget cuts here in France.
Except for the military.
Or would they have liked to have stayed on longer?
Well, probably it's a godsend for the finances of France, because obviously having troops abroad is costing a lot of money. And as was pointed out, they became a problem, a political problem for France, because in those countries they were not wanted anymore. And given the dire financial straits, it's probably wiser for the French to invest more in drones, modern weaponry, as was explained by the French president, than keeping those bases that are costly financially, but also politically, because if you're not wanted in a country 60 years or more after independence, well, there's no reason to stay, and unless you want to become even more unpopular and risk of being kicked out violently as they were from the Sahel.
Let me ask you, Dame Babou, this military camp we're talking about, just to be precise, it's an air base founded in 1919, so one of the oldest, the Camp Jen. It's right next to the international airport. The French lowering their flag, but what about the United States? Because they too have soldiers at the airport in Dakar.
You know, as you say, since 1919, for the population of Senegal doesn't feel like this is the base. It's easier to protect the country, to protect the population. Is there in the as part of the strategy of France. The Americans, their presence in that part of the continent is more discreet to begin with, and they don't have this history of being perceived as the colonizer of Senegal or in Niger, even though they have massive presence with modern weapons. But France didn't have the strategy, neither the images that will permit to be accepted today in this area where you have this coup d'etat in this country like Mali, like Niger. Let's take Mali, for instance. People have the impression that even with the presence of France, nothing was done against the jihadists. And now that the France is kicked out, as Marc called it, nothing has changed in that situation. So I don't think that's you can judge them the same way as the Americans and the French, because the hostility of the youth against France is wider, much wider.
Let me ask you, you mentioned at the outset young people who have pushed back against the former colonial power where you are, those young people who helped in the election of President Bassirou Diomaye Faye. The rhetoric from the campaign of 1 year ago is one thing. What about what it's like when he's now in power governing? And I've noticed that he's had his differences on the domestic front with his prime minister, Ousmane Sonko. Is there going to be brinkmanship when it comes to how you handle France at this point?
I don't really think that they will have many differences when it comes to handling the rhetorics vis-a-vis France, because they have no choice. They are in a very difficult situation, financially speaking, and they have other priority they cannot take care of for now. They have always to keep on doing electoral campaign as they did. And I'm sure if in terms of style, Ousmane Sonko is more of a firebrand than Diomaye, but in form of the substance of their discourse and their handling of relationship with France, they have to have the same rhetoric, the same discourse vis-a-vis the youth who have decided the election and may come back and give them a lot of trouble if they feel like nothing has changed in this area.
One final question for you, Marc Perelman. You still have one lone military base in Djibouti. What does it tell you when you have France, the United States, and China, who all have military bases in Djibouti?
That's probably the only place in the world where those different powers coexist. It's true that Djibouti was a French-only military base for decades. But then over the years, Djibouti realized that it's strategically located, and they used this geographical advantage to lure other military powers with financial means. That is the United States, that has a very large base in Djibouti, as well as the Chinese. France has said, for now, we'll keep the 1,500 soldiers we have. Now there's no reason for us to leave if there are Americans, Chinese, and even others coming in. They say it's really strategic because it's a totally different location. But clearly the fact that the curtain is falling over French military bases in Western and Central Africa is the end of an era. It's not necessarily the end of France-Afrique as it's known, but it's a very rich symbol for at least those countries.
Marc Perelman, many thanks. I want to thank Dame Babou for joining us from New York City. Stay with us. Much more to come here on France 24.